Okay, good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Catherine Kiprop, as you have heard. I come from Moi University in Kenya. I am a professor of educational management and leadership with diverse interests in matters of gender, strategic management, decolonial studies, and so on and so forth. So I'm here to look at harmonized digital policies and higher education, implications for African universities and research institutions. If you didn't notice something about this panel, is that 3 of us are Kenyans, including the chair of the session. It is only Bashman who has spoiled the party, but we shall make him a Kenyan after this. So we might default into Kiswahili when things become tough. I'm just warning you, I'm joking. Thank you. Yes, so I want to welcome you to this presentation. And this work specifically explores how unified digital policy frameworks affect African universities with a focus on sovereignty, collaboration, and institutional autonomy. I want to say that I was particularly interested in this topic because as an African scholar and advocate for educational justice, my interest in digital policy harmonization stems from a desire to see African universities shape their own digital futures. And you will realize that in my presentation, I bring about the issue of fragmentation, or rather that it's obvious that our digital policies are highly fragmented, and because of this, therefore, it hinders research collaboration and even complicates data governance and threatens academic freedom. So I'm motivated by the urgent need to protect institutional autonomy, promote epistemic sovereignty, and even ensure that digital transformation in African higher education is locally grounded, inclusive, and also has a decolonial perspective or a decolonial vision. So, sorry, I'm going to move to the next slide. My God, now. Is it not moving? Okay, sorry. Yeah, this is a Gen Z, so it's better in digital technology. Yeah, so I also want to maybe speak about why African universities or why harmonization matters for higher education or for African universities. So we all know that universities are knowledge producers, of course, and also policy informants. So African universities are not just policy consumers, or they are not just consumers of policy, but they are actually generators of knowledge and evidence that can inform policy frameworks. And so this includes the fact that they conduct research on local digital challenges, things like connectivity, digital rights, cybersecurity, and so on. They also produce context-specific or context-sensitive data that can guide inclusive and effective policy harmonization. And they also offer interdisciplinary expertise that is from law and ethics to even data science and education technology. They are also guardians of academic freedom, whereby, guardians of academic freedom and digital sovereignty, so that harmonized digital policies, therefore, must preserve this academic freedom and uphold institutional autonomy. And so it means, therefore, that these universities require flexible yet protective data governance regimes for teaching, research, and collaboration. We also know that they are also collaborators, or rather they collaborate across the borders or there's collaboration among universities across the borders that enables teaching and research partnerships. Sorry. Yes, and of course they build capacity, that is educating digital professionals and policy literate leaders. And they're also, of course, equity advocates for promoting inclusivity, indigenous knowledge, and decolonial digital futures. So now over to my discussion on this topic. As a way of introduction, I want to say that universities and research institutions are increasingly reliant on digital tools for everything, right from online learning platforms to data-driven research and even international partnerships. For example, we have tools like LMS, that is the learning management systems, the cloud-based research databases, which are now integral to academic operations. But the issue is that this digital shift occurs in a complex policy landscape where each African nation has its own data governance, cybersecurity, and even digital education regulations, and which lead to fragmentation that complicates compliance and even collaboration. So Africa, at this point, is at its pivotal moment in its digital transformation journey. We have organs like the Africa Union's Digital Transformation Strategy of 2020, which aims to create, 2020 to 2030, which aims to create a single digital market by enhancing digital infrastructure, skills, and innovation across the continent. We also have this one that we call the Continental Free Trade Area, that is AFCTA, and I think this policies or policy frameworks were highly cited by earlier speakers who spoke right from when we started this conference. So this again seeks to streamline cross-border data flows. Just help me. Can you help me just move this a little? I'm sorry again. Does this one maybe? Yeah. Oh, I use this. Sorry, I'm used to the touch. Sorry, I think I'm so used to the touch screen. I didn't realize this is not a touch screen. Yeah. Sorry. So I've talked about the African Continental Free Trade Area, that is AFCTA protocol on digital trade that seeks to streamline cross-border data flows and e-commerce, which directly impacts academic collaboration by facilitating data sharing and joint research. So these regional frameworks are critical for unlocking digital economies and also fostering cohesive digital ecosystems. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, but their success also depends on harmonizing policies to reduce barriers for institutional operations across borders. So for universities, I must say that harmonized policies can ensure consistent data protection standards, enable seamless research partnerships, and also and support innovation aligned with Africa's development agenda goals. So I want us to look at the implication of digital policy harmonization for higher education in Africa. And I have presented it in those three cycles, which actually focus on three key areas. which we are saying that, which include data governance, academic collaboration, and institutional autonomy, which are all interconnected. And at their intersection lies the goal of harmonized digital policy. So this is just a visual, that emphasizes that effective digital policy must actually balance these three dimensions to ensure inclusive and context-sensitive outcomes. So when we talk about the first cycle, which is on data governance and privacy, we are saying that universities must actually comply with the varying national data protection laws, such as the Kenya's Data Protection Act, which again, I think was cited by many of you who presented earlier, especially that there was a lot of presentation about the digital landscape in Kenya. There is the South African, which we're calling POPIA 2013. There is Nigeria's NDEPS 2019. When conducting research, especially across border projects involving sensitive data. And an example is the health or social science research. So fragmented, as you can see, these are fragmented kind of regulations, which create compliance uncertainty, which also increase what we call administrative burdens and even legal risks. So an example is that if universities are collaborating across borders, they may actually face conflicting requirements for data storage, issues of consent or even transfer, which sometimes can delay or even derail research. And therefore, a harmonized approach could actually standardize data protection protocols. But we are also saying that in as much as that is anticipated, it also must be flexible to accommodate local practices and also research needs. So, so that is on the first cycle. Then on academic collaboration and cross-border research, it actually highlights the importance of regional and international research partnerships for African universities to address continental challenges like health, education, and even climate change. And again, inconsistent cybersecurity policies across the countries may hinder these collaborations by creating barriers to data sharing and even joint projects. So, for instance, differing standards for secure data transfer or even ethical review processes can actually discourage universities from participating in multi-country initiatives. I'm sure most of us have collaborated with other countries, and sometimes we are required to get clearance, from our IREX. I don't know whether we call it IREX. I know in the USA it's the IRBs and all that. And sometimes because of those issues of fragmentations, each country has its own, protocols, which sometimes may be difficult for another country to actually comply. So this sometimes can even, or rather in most cases, discourages people from participating in those kinds of collaborations. So harmonization could streamline these processes, enabling platforms maybe like regional research networks, regional networks, but which must also avoid overly rigid frameworks that limit innovation or exclude smaller institutions with limited technical capacity. And then when it comes to institutional autonomy, which is the third cycle, we are saying that national digital policies such as restrictions on digital content or internet governance can also threaten academic freedom and institutional autonomy. An example of this is policies that impose strict controls on online platforms or data access may limit also universities' abilities to design curricula or conduct independent research or even engage globally. So again, harmonized policies must protect universities and universities' ability to govern their digital infrastructure and also maintain epistemic autonomy, ensuring that African knowledge systems are not sidelined by external models like the EU's GDPR. So this is particularly critical, especially in preserving indigenous research priorities and also local consent practices. So there is need, okay, yeah. So what I'm suggesting in this paper is that there is actually need for a balanced approach, that harmonization must actually strike a balance between regional alignment, for example, the AU's digital transformation strategy, the Malabo Convention, and the national flexibility. So one-size-fits-all policy risks actually ignoring local academic cultures or traditional knowledge systems and institutional diversity, which will potentially lead to epistemic injustice or reduced innovation. So, I can see my time is gone. So in terms of the conceptual and theoretical approach, this study adopts a conceptual approach which synthesizes existing literature, policy documents, like the AU strategies, national data, laws, and so on, and also adopts what we call a scenario modeling, which I'll speak about it as we, at the end of it. And so we are using the digital sovereignty theory and the institutional theory, and the digital sovereignty theory focuses on the ability of states and institutions to govern their digital infrastructure and knowledge systems in alignment with their socio-political and cultural values. And so in the African context, digital sovereignty here is crucial to counter historical technological dependency and ensure university controls their research outputs and student data without being overshadowed by the global North standards. And then the institutional theory examines how organizations like universities adapt to external pressures such as regulatory mandates. So universities face pressures to conform to national and regional digital policies through what we call the coercive or legal requirements, the mimetic, that is adopting best practices, and also the normative, which is professional standards forces. So this framework helps analyze how harmonized policies might standardize university governance potentially at the cost of flexibility and innovation. So looking at the policy landscape, just want to go through the various policy dispensations that exist in Africa, and even within specific countries, and even in Africa as a region. So this shows how national laws have emerged in various countries, and also regional instruments as well that have been developed, like the Malabo Convention, and are still underutilized. So this results, of course, into what we call compliance uncertainty and even inconsistent cyber security protections across the continent. So as you can see from that map, we can actually appreciate the fact that Africa's digital policy environment is actually complex, is a complex mosaic of national regulations which are shaped by domestic priorities and also international influences and varying levels of implementation. And so this fragmentation poses significant challenges for higher education institutions which actually rely on these digital tools for teaching, for research, teaching, and also collaboration. I would have wanted to go through each of them, but I think because of time, we can all read. Those policies are there. You can look at the three, Kenya's DPA policy, the South African's POPIA and DEPs, and also look at the Malabo Convention and also the AU's digital transformation. I think they are quite elaborated in documents, so let me note, because that's not the gist of my presentation. I just wanted us to say that there are challenges in terms of compliance of these policies because of uncertainty, because of compliance uncertainty, because of issues of cyber security, inconsistencies, and also varying enforcement mechanisms. So, So again, the implications on this fragmentation on university or on Africa's universities, so of course issues of compliance, like under data governance, which are our 3 key focus areas, you find that there are issues of compliance with varying laws. It also affects cross-border research. As far as academic collaboration is concerned, issues of cyber security inconsistencies and also hindering joint projects. And then on institutional autonomy, there are also issues of restriction on digital content and also impact on academic freedom. So what this paper is proposing is that if we have to transition to digital harmonization, then it means that universities must be brought on board, or rather they must be involved. There must be that inclusive implementation that involves actually universities as stakeholders. Yes, we appreciate the fact that regional frameworks like the AU's Digital Transformation Strategy and Malabo Convention have already provided the path towards coherence, but this success will only depend if inclusive implementation, which involves universities as stakeholders, is actually appreciated. And then now I want to bring you to the attention of this scenario modeling, which is now the path towards harmonization. Then how do we move forward as universities? And so I did what we call a scenario modeling to see what is happening. What will happen if we have to have 3 case scenarios, which is full harmonization, fragmentation, and now I propose what we call a hybrid model. So scenario modeling is actually a critical tool for understanding the potential futures of digital policy harmonization in Africa. And so the study proposes these 3 scenarios to assess how different approaches to digital policy alignment could impact African universities and research institutions. So each scenario represents a distinct pathway with unique implications for data governance, academic collaboration, and institutional autonomy. And the main goal is to evaluate these pathways to identify a model that best supports Africa's digital transformation while addressing the needs of higher education institutions. So as you look at that table, it actually summarizes the 3 future scenarios explored in this paper, and that is full harmonization, fragmentation, and hybrid model. And each has unique benefits and also challenges. And so as we look at full harmonization, I think you can read all the details, but full harmonization supports standardization, but risks ignoring local needs. And then when we look at fragmentation, it allows flexibility, but also leads to inefficiency and also legal uncertainty. And now the 3rd model, which is the hybrid, which I recommend, or this study recommends, it offers contextual flexibility while aligning with continental goals. So when this kind of a table actually helps decision makers to compare the structural trade-offs at a glance. And so when it comes to the impact on in the universities, we are saying that harmonization simplifies compliance, yes? It could also, at the same time, constrain universities' flexibility to innovate or adapt to local needs. So, so this scenario, therefore, risks creating what we call a legally elegant but operationally problematic framework where universities are bound by inflexible rules that hinder their ability to address Africa's specific challenges. sorry. Yes. 1 minute. Okay. So just as a way of recommending, because my time is up, I just want to say that in moving forward, this presentation recommends a hybrid regulatory model, as I've already indicated. And I'm saying that universities should be actively involved in policy development. Regional cooperation should also be strengthened while preserving national autonomy, and data governance should also include clear research provisions. So these recommendations operationalize the hybrid model, balancing regional coherence with national and institutional flexibility. And so they empower universities to navigate the digital landscape as active stakeholders, fostering collaboration, innovation, and digital sovereignty. And just to conclude, I want to say that digital policy harmonization holds both promise and risk. A hybrid approach best supports Africa's diverse institutional needs and promotes digital sovereignty. So African universities must play a proactive role in shaping a just and inclusive digital future. So I want to urge us that we work together, or let us work together to ensure African universities lead the way in building a digital ecosystem that is innovative, inclusive, and also uniquely African. Thank you very much. And yeah, I wanted to say asante sana. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good morning. I think in the course of the last couple of months, we've heard a lot of things about AI. In fact, even during the last couple of days at this workshop, we have discussed what I consider to be the three main factors in AI advancement and adoption. These are data, infrastructure, and regulation. You know, when we talked about data, we spoke about how data is collected, how it's stored, who stores it, whether we have any local storage or it's stored away, and what this means for us. Yesterday, we visited a data center. And in many ways, we also spoke about the infrastructure disparities on the continent. In fact, they showed us a map of where most of the data cables are and the challenges in connecting the continent. But today, I'm focusing on one main aspect, which is regulation, which in this case, for example, comes from the idea that the African Union has proposed a strategy for the continent. So in July last year, which is about a year ago, the AU proposed a strategy for the continent. The strategy focuses on a few things, which I will highlight, most of which I consider to be positive, but two which I will focus on that I think are challenges for the continent, which then we must assess to see whether they work for us. This continental strategy proposes an idea that the continent can harness AI for its socioeconomic development and to enhance prosperity. And it says that, of course, AI has transformative potential on the continent, which is true, as it does also in other regions in the world, in Europe, in Asia, or in America. But my core argument here will be that the proposal by the African Union Continental AI Strategy to harmonize regulation, which is central in its strategy, does not serve the continent, and in fact, risks undermining the continent's digital sovereignty. And I will do this by looking at the approach taken in the AI strategy by the continent, and then critiquing it by way of giving solutions or alternatives, which I think might serve the continent better. This map of the continent that I use here is very close to what we saw yesterday at the data center, showing that there's a lot of connection around the coasts or the edges of the continent, but little internally. So then we must ask the question of whether it will be possible then for a continent that looks like this in terms of connection to have a harmonized approach in terms of regulation. So the purpose of this study is to first assess the continental AI strategy, two, to identify some of the challenges that are posed by the idea of having unified regulation, considering the diverse context, reviewing four case studies of African countries that have AI strategies. And I select these countries, from the north, east, south, and west to show some of the differences they have in their strategies, some of which mirror the African Union continental strategy, and others that have a different outlook. And then to say whether this could guide us in terms of what an approach for Africa should be. The image you see there, which is AI generated, of course, presents a very diverse continent. And the beauty of it is that it shows us that, the old and the young, the animals and the land, the trees and the vegetation, the mountains and the rivers, all have a future in the continent. But then can this future be harmonized if we have one strategy that doesn't address the different challenges in which all these people come from? So I'll begin by explaining the concept under which this paper lays. So it's two main theories, of course. The first, which we have discussed, is harmonization. The idea that the continent can take one unified approach towards the regulation of AI, and that national policies then will be required to align with this continental policy for coherence. But then a second one, which speaks about digital sovereignty. And two scholars here, I note, one is Denardis, who actually argues that for Africa to have self-determination in the age of AI, then it must consider that national agency is very important over digital infrastructure, that every single country must have its own power about what to do about digital infrastructure, which ones to adopt and how to adopt them. And I also quote Raymond, who spoke to us this week and said that we need to avoid perpetuating new forms of dependence. And how do we avoid perpetuating these new forms of dependence if Africa's data is collected and controlled in the West or away from Africa? So this will be the two, in a sense, conflicting concepts that I will try to interrogate in this paper. So the AU continental strategy has three main objectives, or has three main pillars, in my view. The first is to set a unified vision for AI deployment across the continent. The second is a recognition of ethical AI principles, fairness, inclusivity, which I think is very important, because at least it offers some impetus, a sense of direction. And the third is to promote regional collaboration for data sharing and AI development. This third pillar, in my view, is more aspirational than it is practical, because the continent has struggled with regional collaboration. Today, for example, we know, Africans cannot even move across countries. We cannot share data across countries. Even neighboring countries, for example, do not have this kind of collaboration in existing economic and political structures. So to assume that it will be possible then for AI to, in a sense, overtake all these other structural problems of collaboration and integration is simply a lie. So there are two risks then that this continental AI strategy poses. The first one is a one-size-fits-all approach, which also Professor Kiprop, I think, mentioned. And the second one, which I will talk about shortly, is the potential of regulatory mimicry from the minority global north. So on the one-size-fits-all approach, again, I bring back this picture, this image, which shows us the diversity on the continent. But more importantly, I think what we must recognize is the profound disparities we have on the continent in terms of infrastructure, in terms of laws, in terms of understanding of what these things mean. As I said, AI has a great potential for changing the continent. But these conversations are not being held in African countries. They're not being held in villages. They're not being held in schools. They're not being held in academic institutions, in civil society. They're being held at perhaps top level, sometimes just in government, or in people who have an interest in business. So when these conversations are not being held across the continent, and when these varying levels of infrastructure or regulation, then it becomes very difficult to say that all these countries can be considered to be equal. So the assumption made by the Continental strategy is that there's an equal readiness, that if we roll out a regulation or we roll out one single program, it should fit in all these countries, which is false, because then we do not have this kind of readiness. And Birhanu, who spoke to us here from Ethiopia, told us, for example, that in Ethiopia, they're just setting up data protection laws, and they're in the early stages of understanding what AI is. But as you will see, countries like South Africa, for example, have a more diverse digital economy. So to expect, for example, that the same regulation applying to Ethiopia would apply to South Africa would mean two things. That one, this goal is unachievable for those who are not yet there, but also restricts those who are already past the goals that are being set. And this is a challenge we have in terms of our one-size-fits-all approach on the continent. The second one, and perhaps more important in the conversation of digital sovereignty, is the idea of mimicry from Europe, Canada, the US, and China. And Raymond, I think, painted a very good picture of the fact that these different jurisdictions have different approaches. Europe, for example, takes a risk-based approach. China takes a state-led approach. America takes more of a market-based approach with a national strategy. And this means that there are conflicting approaches being taken by different countries. So the danger is now the African Union Continental AI strategy attempts to just bring all this in. And what you see in its text is confusion between a rights-based approach, a risk-based approach, a sector-based approach, a state-led approach, or a continental approach. And the challenge with this mimicry is that we risk adopting regulations without local reality, without local context. Because then we must ask, will this approach work in Namibia? And I have to mention, for example, yesterday I was having this conversation with my brother Bashman here. And he was asking me whether Namibia is in Southern Africa or Eastern Africa. So that tells us that even within the continent, we do not have very basic knowledge about each other's contexts. So the danger with this is a lot of reference to the strategies of other jurisdictions then means that we do not have local realities in place. We miss out on informal economies which shape Africa, because in Europe we don't have as much informal economy. We risk on losing indigenous knowledge, because as we had this conversation about language and these other things, AI is not going to be coded in Kikamba or Kikuyu or in Ndebele or in Zulu. It's going to be coded perhaps in English, French, Portuguese, perhaps Swahili, and a few other vernacular languages, but not as many. But what becomes of the knowledge, the indigenous knowledge that is available in other languages? And then lastly, the varying capabilities that we have in these countries. So what we risk then is reproducing digital colonialism, saying that, okay, the AI race is now open, but Africa still runs the risk of running behind and being last, as it has been in the other three revolutions, where there's not been an approach that favors the continent. The approaches have always come from the global minority north, and the continent has not been able to be brave enough to say that this will not work for us. So these are the three main challenges that I note about implementing the regulation proposed by the African Continental AI Strategy. The first is institutional capacity. There was a State of Africa AI Preparedness report by CPIT. CPIT is the Center for Intellectual Property and Technology at Strathmore University. And they did a research to show how much capacity we have on the continent in terms of knowledge in AI among the population, but also even among the most tech-savvy people. And what we notice is that there's a shortage in skilled personnel, people who are able to even code, for example, and even for the majority of the population, the users of AI, being able to prompt these AI bots. So the research showed that a very small percentage of people understand prompt engineering and how that then leads to what you get as an output from an AI. This is considered basic, for example. But if we are at a point where we do not have these skills, then it is not possible then to say that we are moving at the same pace. And then there's insufficient multi-stakeholder engagement. This AI race requires a lot of inclusion. Those in civil society, those in academia, those in the technical space, entrepreneurs, and government. But we have not had these conversations, for example, cutting across these various levels, such that we're engaging everyone to get their views and to have a broader participation. Now, the lack of this broader participation means that it is something that is going to be restricted perhaps just by the government, favoring certain investors, and it never gets to the people who are actually affected by the use of this AI. And lastly, the challenge of weak enforcement. So as you will see from the case studies, which are coming up shortly, most of Africa's countries, at least the four that I referenced in this study, do not have, of course, AI regulation. So what we do is use regulation in other sectors. So either sector-specific regulation or data protection laws. So you have a very fragmented approach in terms of the regulation. So you either look at the regulation for certain sectors or data privacy and ICT technology and find answers in each of these different legislation. And the danger with this, of course, is fragmentation. And with fragmentation, then you cannot have an effective mechanism. So for example, if someone would need to sue a chatbot in Kenya, or an AI for that matter, or an AI agent, there's no mechanism to do it because it don't fall under any of the current legal framework. So I'll start with the first case study, which is South Africa. And of course, as I said, the context in South Africa is that this is a relatively advanced digital economy. So there's more connectivity, there's a higher use of internet, for example, as compared to other parts of the continent. And South Africa, for example, has also established a number of research hubs on AI. So there's this, I think, I forget the name now in full, but it's a council for something Inacio research, yeah. And then there's universities also, they have a lot of research hubs. And there's also a data protection law, a very strong one in South Africa. So it has some headway in terms of the progress they've made with AI. And they also have a policy that covers aspects like talent, research and development, innovation, and ethics. So it is a bit robust in terms of what it covers. But the gap that is noticed in South Africa is the lack of a dedicated AI regulatory framework, a specific one. So as we said, we borrow from these existing laws in order to regulate AI, although South Africa is a bit advanced as compared to the other African countries. Next is Kenya. So for Kenya, Kenya has had progressive digital policies. The Data Protection Act in Kenya also is very elaborate. The Office of the Data Commissioner has been issuing a lot of decisions. So there's some progress that has been made in data and digital sovereignty. However, there's absence in AI-specific regulation, and the emphasis here is less on ethics and principles, but more on collaboration. So the Kenyan AI strategy, for example, focuses more on being a leader in the region in AI, not on sectors, not on skills, not on talent development, not on research. It focuses more on collaboration and being a leader on the continent. Let's look at Nigeria. Nigeria has already had some little integration of AI into its health and financial systems, but it doesn't provide for any specific legislation on AI. And Nigeria looks to be a leader on the globe, not even on the continent, on the globe. This is the focus of Nigeria, to be a leader on the globe and to guide deployment of AI in financial services and healthcare. Again, you see these are different priorities. We go to Egypt. So Egypt aims to be a leader in the Middle East and Africa. So, it's standing in between Middle East and Africa. And is looking to integrate already AI in education, professional development, and international partnerships. Again, you see there are different goalposts. They have different priorities. They have different intentions. So what this tells us is that just these 4 African countries, one, take a different approach from what the EU suggests, and then secondly, look in different directions when it comes to AI policy and strategy. So what does this mean for the continent? These are the proposed alternatives, for example. The first thing is to agree to decentralize and have a flexible regulation. So my proposal will be that first we allow countries to have their own national policies, depending on their context, and to say that we are tailoring these policies to our local realities with minimum guidelines from the African Commission, saying that, hey, even if this is your national policy, at the very least, there are certain principles you have to adhere to. There are certain considerations in terms of data sharing that we have to have. And then perhaps the second step on that is using the existing regional economic blocks, then to begin some regional AI policy together. So first the countries, and then, like this African community, the ECOWAS, the SADC, there's the countries in Northern Africa, having an approach where even amongst yourselves, then you're able to agree on a few things, because then you share a lot of infrastructure and you have a lot of movement between each of these countries. And the second one, of course, to have multi-stakeholder participation, which I have elaborated about. But the most important, also the last one here, is innovation support. There's been very little support in terms of innovation on the continent. And this explains why then there's very little knowledge of people about AI. Even our students who study, IT or computer-related programs don't have support on AI. And this is what Professor Kiprop was talking about. Even our education systems in themselves are not going beyond and saying, hey, you cannot continue to teach an IT student basics about a computer and a CPU and a monitor and a mouse and not teach them about AI. Teach them about prompt engineering, about coding for AI. Yeah? So even our education is yet to catch up. And then if we don't have this education catching up, we also don't have innovation support. We don't have incentives for entrepreneurs who want to do business in AI. And then lastly, my conclusion and proposals for this decentralized relationship. Again, I bring back the image of a continent that is diverse, a continent that is at different levels in terms of infrastructure capability, but one that has capacity to move together, but in phases. The first phase being national strategies that address the local realities, innovation within the country that supports entrepreneurship and supports education of the general public and also of talent development. And then, so that's building capacity. And then safeguards against exploitative foreign AI dominance. Because we do not have any safeguards, for example, preventing, for example, you notice in Europe or in America, you cannot use DeepSeek for, this regulation and this. But in Africa, there's no regulation. I'm not saying there should be regulation because it comes from China. All I'm saying is there has to be safeguards to tell us why we should use ChatGPT or Gemini or Perplexity and not DeepSeek and not another AI agent. And what the government considers as risks to its citizens when data is all over. And then lastly, we need to have AI governance that aligns with Africa's trajectory, which, as I've said, might look very disruptive, but I think can be guided in one direction. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm Bashman Mohammed, and I think I have the privilege of being the last presenter. So the benefit of it is that I can just say I rest my presentation on what everyone has said. That won't be the case. So my background is in law, but to be candid, day one, I was a bit skeptical after everybody was talking about AI, data everything. And I began to rack my head, how would my presentation fit into this? But I think yesterday, my fear was a bit, my fears are gone in the sense that the presentation of Dr. Mohammed and Kauna and others kind of spoke to the reality of my presentation. Because to be candid, the one we all spoke and then we left out a critical element of data, which is the human behind the data. So that's what my presentation will center on. So, but basically I'll be looking at harmonization, which the two speakers have done justice to it. But I will be narrowing my presentation to the digital labor platform. I think this is the first time we are using labor platform. We're using digital platform to now I'm bringing in the labor component into the discourse. So here's the outline of my presentation. I'll start with an opening statement, typical of lawyers. Thereafter, I will frame the problem, after which I will share the methodology, then the analysis I've done so far, and preliminary findings, then the closing statement. So please, and just a caveat, it's still a work in progress, but I hope to conclude before the end of the month. So these are some statements. First is that there can be no international trade without labor. This is coming from the former, from the ILO. Then there's also the statement that most AI tools require huge amount of hidden labor to make them work at all. I think that was demonstrated heavily yesterday. Then lastly, citing Dr. Mohammed and Professor Mark, they mentioned that digital labor is what? Commoditized without due regard to worker welfare. So the use of that, you can see the welfare is small, it's deliberate. And I think we're all guilty of this, even until yesterday when we begin to bring their issue into discourse. The one who spoke without even mentioning the folks behind the data. So in framing the problem, the ILO, that's the global standard setting body, by their estimate, 73 workers out of 820 million total workforce in the selected occupation, they work in the digital labor platform. So you can see the number is very, 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 very huge. But a unique characteristic of this platform is that it is transnational in nature. That's one unique feature of the digital labor platform. It's not the traditional form of employment wherein you put people under a premises, or you think you can regulate them within a specific national boundary. And importantly, it's also mentioned that when undertaking this work, there's heavy presence of majority of the workers are in the global south, and I think Africa is one of the top. Then a key issue, which I think Martin did some justice to it also, is that there's this debate around how to regulate this platform. So several approaches have been adopted, but the two divide is between adopting a territorial approach, okay, this is a national thing, let's regulate it internally, or a transnational approach. So these are the two divide, and I think Professor Catherine also mentioned, she introduced the third, which is the hybrid method. And as I said earlier, that's the beauty of presenting last. So I think I will be adding that context into my presentation too. So, but the big question is that which of these best suits the African labor market? So to answer this question, I adopted a mixed methodology of first undertaking a literature review. Thereafter, I did a legal analysis of the existing legal frameworks, and then I make a comparison with the European context, because by the title of my presentation, I'm trying to see whether there's any lesson we can learn from the EU. So after the DEX review, some noticeable gaps were identified. The truth is that, as you can see, the two speakers before me referenced some existing legal framework. But the reality is that all these framework were heavy on data, digital governance, privacy. No mention was made to the labor component of it. So this is a huge gap. Then, in addition, also, as I said earlier, countries, I think the two speakers also mentioned, countries have been adopted a nationalistic approach to it. Kenya, they have their own data protection law. Nigeria, motherland, has a most complicated form of labor data governance. Year in year, we keep churning out a framework. If you go to here in South Africa, they also have their own labor data governance regime. So this approach, the truth is that it's not fit for purpose when it comes to digital labor platform, which I mentioned earlier is transnational in nature. A practical example is that because in the digital labor platform, we have two forms of workers, those that do the work on site and those that do online. A typical online worker can be in a remote village in Nigeria and will be working for a tech company in Nairobi. So if you want to regulate that particular worker, are you going to use the Kenyan law or you use the Nigerian law? So that's a big problem. So it means that adopting a territorial approach to regulating platform workers is problematic. So that's but to say that we don't have legislation is going to be too heavy. The actually existing legislation, I think the two speakers before me mentioned it, but to be more specific, we have the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection, the popular Malabo Convention, because I think it was adopted in Malabo. Then we also have the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement of 2018. Then we have the protocol, the AU Protocol on Free Movement of 2018. This is, I think I will expatiate on this later. Then we also have the Protocol on Trade in Service, 2019. Then interestingly also, and that's what actually delayed my paper, there is a new after Digital Trade Protocol 2024. It was adopted in February, but negotiation on some thematic area are still ongoing. And I think the after secretariat in Ghana, they are not being cooperative. They are not cooperating with me. They are saying that, look, there are documents we cannot release for now because negotiation is still ongoing. But importantly, to emphasize that we also have some sub-regional frameworks that regulate digital governance within the continent. Like we have the ECOWAS protocol, we have the EAC, that's the East African Community, then we have the Southern African Development Community. So these are also frameworks that did not expressly mention data governance, but they kind of regulate the labor component of digital governance. So briefly, I know I'm still within time. So the Malabo Convention, as I said earlier, is a more generic framework that regulates data protection and cyber security. But when you compare, and then interestingly also to know that the Malabo Convention adopts a hybrid form of approach. I think is in Article 12, they mentioned the fact that national member states should endeavor to regulate data governance in their jurisdiction. And thereafter, they made a proposal for a regional level framework. So you can see they are adopting both a territorial approach at the same time a transnational approach. But importantly, when you contrast this framework with the EU General Data Protection Regulation, you will see that the EU adopt a territorial approach in the sense that a EU citizen and even resident is protected under the General Data Protection, but that's not the case with respect to the Malabo Convention. Then the almighty AFTA, which was highly celebrated. So the AFTA is the current thing, but regrettably, in the whole of the articles, there's heavy mention of free movement of goods and services. We've taken time, because I used to engage with a US-based international organization, we've taken the time to review that particular agreement. We read it, we didn't find any single provision on labor. If you want to facilitate free movement of goods and services, how do you do that without labor? So that's a big minus in that particular agreement. And when you contrast this with the EU, especially Article 45 of the treaty establishing the European Union, there's a specific provision that not just free movement of goods and services, but of persons. Outside that movement, they also guarantee them the right of residence and also the right of establishment. This is evidently missing with respect to AFTA agreement. Then, to cure that, we have the EU Free Movement Protocol. Interestingly, as I said earlier, it was signed the same year with AFTA, 2018. But up to date, as we speak, only 4 countries have ratified that protocol. And I think by provision, that I think is Article 33 of that provision, they require 15 states to sign before it comes into force. So as we said, we have a beautiful piece of legislation, but that has not been ratified. And as I said, also this contrasts with the European experience, where the enabling protocol has been signed by all member states. Then interestingly, still under the AFTA, there are 8 protocols, one of which is a protocol on trade in services. Interestingly, this particular protocol mentioned digital trade and defined digital trade as a digitally enabled transaction of trade in persons, no, in goods and services that can either be digitally or physically delivered. Earlier, I mentioned that in the digital labor platform, we have two broad categorization of workers, those that do this thing online and those that do it in person. So these forms work force specifically under this protocol, but regrettably also, the protocol did not provide provision for governance of the labor component of it. It's just about goods and services. So who are those that will make the goods come into be, or who are those that will render those services? There are no specific provision for them. Then a more specific provision or protocol is the ongoing digital trade protocol, which also specifically also mention folks undertaking work on digital labor platform, but without also providing any governance as to how they are going to do their work. But also importantly to mention also that this particular protocol, interestingly also admitting that digital trade can be undertaken either in person or online, adopted a territorial approach to it, that it is each state party that will legislate on this. Going back to our earlier example, how do you expect a remote worker working for a big tech company, a remote worker in Nigeria, working in Niger Delta area, to be regulated by a big tech in Nairobi? So there's a problem. So there are some interesting findings so far. One being that the current landscape is in chaos, in the sense that why the AFTA make copious provision around how to facilitate trade and services within the African continent, there's no single mention of the labor component of it. Then also, importantly, it's also mentioned that there's no specific mention of digital mediated work in Africa, unlike the practice in the EU. Like in the EU now, just I think 2023, the European Parliament, after taking submission from both the Council and Commission, enacted the EU Platform Workers Directive. That kind of answers some big questions around classification of platform workers, because there's a lot of argument around whether they are workers in terms of subordinate workers or they are independent contractor. So this particular directive provides some guidance around how they should be classified, and then provide some criteria around. We don't have that same with respect to the African context. But interestingly, relying on the submission of the two speakers, also, as I said, we have some existing frameworks within the continent that could be adopted in our drive towards harmonizing the regulatory space. Because evidently, we can't regulate data through adopting a territorial approach. Nigerian, you make your law. South African, you make your law. Kenyan, you make your law. That won't work. Because important, as I said earlier, a key feature of this is that it's transnational. It's beyond what a single national state can say they want to govern. And that's the wisdom behind the Brussels effect when the EU passed the General Data Protection Regulation. So another thing to point is there's ongoing discussion within the context of the ILO around decent work for workers in the platform economy, and that offer another promises, because I think as of last outing in Geneva, there was agreement that there should be a convention and a recommendation for platform workers. So if there's a convention from the ILO, and virtually all African states are member states of the ILO, they can come back, ratify it, domesticate it, and see how some of those provisions can be translated into regional. But just also mention also, based on experience, there's this misconception that that something is working in EU, we work in Africa. It's a big thing. Africa is not the same thing as Europe. Even in terms of number, African, the population is over 1.5 billion people. That's double the size of Europe. And in terms of homogeneity, we cannot compare ourselves with Europe. We have our own differences. What has worked so far is the sub-regional integration. Like in the West Africa, we have the ECOWAS, wherein this idea of free movement is working very fine. You go to East Africa, you see this free movement within that particular enclave is working very fine. Come to South Africa. So I think it's preliminary, but what I will be recommending at the end of this, when I'm done with this paper, is that we should look rather, I think Martin's also mentioned something similar, we should start very small. Rather than thinking that we can have a continental framework, we should look at having a sub-regional framework, because by practice, by our experience, at the sub-regional level, we tend to be more homogeneous, compare and contrast. I was joking with Zaid that whenever I'm in Ghana, I feel as if I'm home. Not because Ghana is closer to Nigeria, because I have to pass through Benin, Togo before getting to Ghana, but because in terms of delicacy, we're somewhat the same. And I think the same happened with folks from East Africa. So in closing, because I want to get reaction as possible, I'm also going back to the opening statement and to close it that we've been discussing AI, but we should bear in mind that most AI tools require a huge number of hidden labor to make them work at all. And I think this was well articulated yesterday by both Kauna and Dr. Mohammed. So I will leave it at that. Sit back. I want to get your feedback and also attend to some of your questions. Thank you very much.